Economic inequality. You hear that phrase all the time. It's a huge, complicated topic. But what if we could boil it down to its essence? What if we could tell the whole story with just a few key charts? Well, that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to chart the major trends that have really defined our economy for decades. First up, I just want you to look at this number, 351 to 1. No context, no clues. Just let that sink in for a second. What in the world could this number possibly mean? Right now, it probably seems totally random. But trust me, by the end of this, you won't just understand what it means, you'll see why it is so central to the story of our economy today. All right, so first things first, let's zoom all the way out. Let's look at the entire pie, all the wealth in the country. The big question is, who's getting what size slice? This chart breaks it down for us. You can see the top 1% of households, they own almost 35% of all the wealth. Then you have the next 9%, they've got about 38.5%. And that means everyone else, the entire bottom 90% of the population, is left with just over a quarter of the nation's wealth. Let's just put those two numbers side by side to really let it sink in. On one side, you have what the top 1% holds, and on the other, what the bottom 90% holds. The difference is pretty stark. And this brings us to our first huge takeaway. Here it is. The wealthiest 1% of American households now hold more wealth than the entire bottom 90%. Combined. Just think about that for a moment. That is an incredible concentration of resources. So you're probably asking, how does something like this even happen? How does wealth get so concentrated? Well, that brings us right back to our mystery number from the beginning, 351 to 1. It's time to find out what it really means. That number, 351 to 1, is what's called the CEO to worker compensation ratio. And it's actually a really simple idea. It just takes what a company's CEO makes in a year and compares it to what the average employee at that same company makes. Now, this massive gap, it hasn't always been this way. Not even close. If you look back to 1965, the ratio was about 20 to 1. Totally different world. By the year 2000, it had absolutely exploded to almost 400 to 1. It's come down a little bit since then, but in 2020, it was still a staggering 351 to 1. I mean, going from a 20 to 1 gap to a 351 to 1 gap in just a couple of generations, that's not just a small adjustment. That signals a complete fundamental shift in how companies think about paying the people at the top versus everyone else. Okay, this brings us to our third chart, and to a really important idea that economists call the Great Decoupling. This is all about the relationship between how much stuff we make and how much we get paid for making it. See, for a long time, the economy worked on a pretty simple promise. As technology improved and companies got more productive, workers would get a share of those gains through higher pay. It made sense, right? A rising tide lifts all boats. And there is no doubt the economy got way more productive. Between 1979 and 2020, net productivity, so how much we produced for every hour of work, it shot up by a massive 61.8%. So the logical question is, did the pay for the typical workers see a similar jump? Did their paychecks grow by about 60% too? The data tells a very different story. Over that exact same period, the typical worker's hourly pay went up by just 17.5%. That's a tiny fraction of the productivity gains that they helped create. When you see these two numbers as bar charts, it hits you. You've got this skyscraper of productivity growth on one side, and then this tiny little building next to it representing worker pay. The two paths just completely went their separate ways. And that is what economists call the Great Decoupling. It's that exact moment in our recent history when that long-standing promise, that link between a growing economy and rising pay for the people who power it, was basically severed. The entrepreneur Nick Hanauer puts this into some really concrete terms. He did the math and figured out that if the income distribution had just stayed where it was back in 1980, the bottom 99% would have an extra $1 trillion every single year. And that just raises a huge question. What would that do for the economy? And that question is the perfect setup for our final section. Let's pull all this data together and ask, what does all this mean for our shared economic future? So what's the story these charts have told us? Let's recap. First, we've seen that wealth is incredibly concentrated at the very top. Second, the pay gap between CEOs and their workers has grown to an enormous size. And third, the fundamental link between how much we produce and how much we earn has been broken.
Look, these data points, they aren't opinions. They're just a measurement of our economic reality. They paint a really clear picture of where we are today. And so the real fundamental question they leave us with isn't about the past, it's about the future. Where do we go from here?